The doctors said his lungs were gone. Not weakened. Not damaged. Gone, consumed so completely by tuberculosis that the men who examined him could not understand how he was still standing, still speaking, still walking the frozen roads of northern China with a pack on his back and a Bible in his hand. His name was Reginald Hollis Carew, and by every medical standard available in the winter of 1907, he should have been dead. He was born in Hamilton, Ontario, in 1874, the second son of a Methodist minister who preached to a congregation small enough that everyone knew each other's middle names and the color of each other's curtains. His father, Reverend Arthur Carew, was a gentleman, the kind who visited the sick without being asked and never once raised his voice in the pulpit. His mother, Florence, kept a garden that was the envy of the street and read to her children every night after supper. History, poetry, scripture, sometimes all three in the same sitting. Reginald grew up in that house like a plant grows near a window, always angled toward the light but never quite touching it. He believed in God the way most boys in Hamilton believed in God, automatically, the way you believe in winter or in the solidity of the kitchen table. It was simply part of the structure of the world. He prayed before meals. He attended church twice on Sundays. He knew the hymns so well he sometimes hummed them without realizing. But if you had pressed him, if you had sat him down in the back pew of his father's church and asked him whether God was real to him, personally, intimately real, he would not have known how to answer you. He was, in the language his father might have used, a good boy. But goodness is not the same thing as fire. When he was 19, his father accepted a call to a larger congregation in Toronto, and the family packed up the Hamilton house and moved. Reginald enrolled at Victoria University that same autumn. He was studying classics, Latin, Greek, the old dead languages that carry the shape of everything the Western world once thought was worth saying. He was good at it. He had a mind that liked precision, that liked the way a sentence could be pinned down to its exact meaning if you knew the grammar well enough. He was also, by his own admission, profoundly empty. He did not know what to call it at the time. He called it restlessness. He called it the natural dissatisfaction of a young man who had not yet found his work. He called it many things that were all partly true and all entirely beside the point. But there was something underneath his days that felt like a room with no furniture in it, vast and quiet and waiting. In the spring of his second year, a man came to speak at the university. His name was Fletcher Davison, a missionary just back from the interior of Shandong province in China, and he spoke with the kind of plainness that is more devastating than eloquence. He did not dramatize. He did not perform. He simply described what he had seen. Villages where the only person who had ever spoken the name of Jesus was a paper merchant who had come through 20 years ago and left a single torn page of the Gospel of Mark tucked under a door. He described children with faces that he could not stop seeing when he closed his eyes at night. He described a hunger, not for food, though that too, but for something he called the Word, and the way people reached for it when it was finally offered to them, reached for it the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. Reginald sat in the third row and felt the floor of his restlessness give way beneath him. He did not make any dramatic decision that evening. He went home. He studied for an examination. He ate breakfast the next morning and attended his Latin tutorial and argued about Virgil with a classmate named Patterson who always argued about everything. But something had shifted. Something had moved in the room with no furniture. He did not tell his parents for 3 months. He was not afraid of their disapproval. His father would have understood. He was afraid, in some way he could not articulate, of saying it out loud before he was certain, because certainty felt like the kind of thing that once announced could not be taken back without some terrible cost. When he finally told his mother, she set down her teacup and looked at him for a long moment. "China," she said. "China," he confirmed. She nodded slowly. She did not weep. She would weep later, privately, in the way that women of her generation had learned to weep, behind closed doors without making a sound, and then dry their faces and come back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. That evening she read to him from the 43rd Psalm, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." He left for China in the autumn of 1898, 24 years old, commissioned by the Methodist Missionary Society, and carrying 2 trunks, a grammar of Mandarin that he had been studying for 8 months, and the persistent sense that he was walking towards something he could not yet see the shape of. The crossing took 6 weeks. There was a storm off Japan that lasted 4 days and left half the passengers too ill to eat. Reginald spent most of those 4 days on his knees, not in prayer at first, simply because kneeling was the only position in which the motion of the ship was tolerable. But somewhere in the middle of the second night, when the ship was groaning and the water was coming over the deck in sheets, and he was genuinely uncertain whether he would see morning, he began to pray. Not the automatic prayers of a Hamilton boyhood. Something else, something that felt less like recitation and more like speech. The way you speak to someone who is actually in the room with you. He arrived in Shanghai in November. He was met at the docks by a senior missionary named Hugh Garnett, who had been in China for 14 years and had the weathered, unhurried quality of a man who has long since made his peace with discomfort. Garnett looked at Reginald's 2 trunks and said, "You'll need to leave one of those." Then he looked at Reginald himself. "You'll be all right," he said. It was not a compliment, it was an assessment. The language nearly broke him. He had prepared. He had studied. He had memorized tones and characters and grammatical patterns with the same precision he had applied to Latin and Greek. But Mandarin in a textbook and Mandarin in a village market were separated by a distance that no amount of preparation could fully bridge. He made mistakes that caused people to laugh at him. He made mistakes that caused people to look alarmed. He once asked for directions to the church, and was instead directed to a very good noodle stall, which, several people later informed him with evident satisfaction, was also worth visiting. He persisted. That was the word for what he did in those first years. He persisted. He learned. He made friends, slowly. He found that the children were more patient teachers than the adults, and he spent hours with them, trading words back and forth like a kind of game. By the end of his first year, he could preach a simple sermon. By the end of his second, he could hear confession and respond in kind. By his third year, people in the market recognized him and called out to him by the name they had given him, Li Mu Si. Something that meant, roughly, the one who is always thinking. He was always thinking, that was the problem. He thought carefully, and he prepared thoroughly, and he preached competently, and he visited the sick and the dying and the grieving, and he did all the things a missionary was supposed to do. But he was aware, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, that something was still missing. His work was efficient. It was not alive. He could explain the gospel. He could not seem to ignite it. People listened to him politely, and sometimes were moved and occasionally came to faith. But he could not shake the feeling that he was operating at a great distance from something, that he was describing a fire from 3 rooms away and calling it warmth. His own prayer life was the truest evidence of this. He prayed. He prayed regularly, at appointed times, with deliberate words, but he had never once, not in Hamilton, not at Victoria, not in China, experienced prayer as anything other than speaking into a room that might or might not be occupied. He was 29 years old, and he had been in China for 5 years when a letter arrived from a man named Cyrus Wentworth. Wentworth was not famous. He was not a theologian or a church leader or a man who had written books. He was a farmer from Manitoba who had felt called to prayer in the same way Reginald had felt called to China. Not dramatically, not with any great experience to point to, but simply as a clear and undeniable fact that emerged from long attention to a persistent inward pressure. Wentworth had formed a small group in his community. They met 3 mornings a week before dawn and prayed for the missionaries. They prayed specifically, by name, by location, by the particular difficulties each missionary had shared in their last letter. They prayed with what Wentworth described, in his plain and slightly awkward prose, as the intention of not stopping until something shifted. Reginald did not know what to make of this letter. It embarrassed him slightly, in the way that plain, sincere things sometimes embarrass people who are accustomed to the armor of education and competence. He wrote back a polite and careful reply. He described his work. He mentioned his congregation. He thanked Wentworth for his faithfulness. He put the letter in a box with the others and did not think much about it. 3 weeks later, he collapsed in the road outside the village of Qinghe. He had been walking back from a funeral. A young mother, 3 children under 6, dead of typhoid in 2 days. and the weight of it had settled on him in a way that years of practice had not made easier to carry. He was also, as he would later learn, already ill. The tiredness he had been dismissing for weeks as overwork was not overwork. The cough he had been ignoring was not a cough that could be ignored. He collapsed, and the local school teacher, a man named Qinghe, found him lying in the road and summoned help. And they carried him back to Garnett's compound, and Garnett took one look at him and sent for the physician. The physician's name was Dr. Wycliffe Stamper, a Scots-Canadian from New Brunswick who had come to China with a medical mission 6 years earlier, and had the sort of direct manner that made people feel simultaneously reassured and slightly alarmed. He examined Reginald with thorough professionalism and then sat down in the chair beside the bed with an expression that Reginald would remember for the rest of his life. "How long have you had the cough?" Stamper asked. 6 months, Reginald said. Perhaps was quiet for a moment. "Your right lung," he said, "is significantly compromised. Your left is better, but not by as much as I'd like." He paused. "You need to go home." "I'm not going home." Stamper looked at him for a long time. He was the kind of man who knew when he had lost an argument before it was over. "Then you need to rest," he said finally. "Complete rest. No village visits, no preaching, no walking in weather like this. And you need to eat. You've lost 2 stone since I saw you last autumn." Reginald agreed to the rest. He could barely sit upright. It was in those weeks of forced stillness that something happened that he never found entirely adequate language to describe. He had nothing to do but read and pray. No meetings to prepare, no sermons to write, no visits to make. For a man whose sense of worth had always been bound up in his usefulness, this was its own kind of suffering. The suffering of a person who is suddenly without the activity that has served as both his vocation and his hiding place. He lay in the small room they had given him, listening to the wind coming off the plains, and for the first time in years he had no way of filling the silence with business. He began to pray, not at appointed times. Continuously, not because he felt particularly devout. He felt, if anything, more spiritually barren than he ever had, but because there was nothing else to do, and the alternative was despair. He prayed for Qinghe, who had found him in the road. He prayed for the young mother's 3 children. He prayed for Wentworth's group of farmers, kneeling in the dark before dawn in Manitoba, praying for people they would never meet. He prayed for Garnett, and for Stamper, and for the village of Qinghe, and for China. All of it, the vastness of it, the teeming, incomprehensible hundreds of millions of it. And he felt as he prayed the way you feel at the edge of an ocean which is small, and also opened. On the 5th day, something shifted. He did not hear a voice. He did not see a light. He did not have any experience that could be printed in a revival pamphlet and distributed at a conference. What happened was much quieter and much more difficult to dismiss. He became suddenly, overwhelmingly, unshakably convinced that the room was occupied. That the silence on the other side of his prayers was not the silence of an empty space, but the silence of a presence. That he had been, all his life, sending letters to an address he was not entirely sure existed, and that the letters had been arriving, and that he had simply never waited at the door long enough to see them received. He wept for a long time. He was not a man who wept easily, and he was slightly mortified by it, and he wept anyway. When Garnett came to check on him that evening, he found Reginald sitting up in bed looking. There was no better word for it. Different, not healthier, not happy exactly, but alive in a way he had not been before, lit from somewhere interior. "What happened?" Garnett asked. "I'm not entirely sure," Reginald said, "but I think I finally stopped pretending." He did not recover quickly. The tuberculosis was not healed by a moment of spiritual clarity, however genuine. His body remained broken for months, but something had changed in the way he inhabited his brokenness. He stopped waiting to be well before he prayed. He prayed from the middle of the illness, from the floor of it, and found that this was not, as he had always vaguely assumed, a lesser form of prayer. It was, if anything, the truest form he had ever known. He began to write to Wentworth, not the polite and careful letters of before. Real letters. Letters about what was actually happening in him, not just around him. He wrote about the collapse in the road. He wrote about Stamper's diagnosis. He wrote about the weeks of stillness and what had moved through them. He wrote in the stumbling and slightly embarrassed prose of a man who has been educated in the arts of precision and is now attempting to describe something that precision alone cannot hold. Wentworth wrote back. His letters were simple and warm and occasionally profound in the way that simple, warm things sometimes are. He told Reginald that the group had been praying specifically, with what he called a particular insistence, in the weeks before his collapse. He wrote, "We did not know what for. We did not know your need in detail, but we felt pressed as a group to pray as though something important depended on it. We hope this is encouraging. We believe it is." Reginald read this letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket against his chest and wore it there for a week. By the spring of 1904, he was well enough to return to work. Not the same work, not in the same way. He had been transformed in the long months of illness into a man who prayed first and planned second, who entered a room the way a man enters a room when he believes someone already important is in it, who asked less from his own competence and more from the source of all competence. He was also, by every reasonable measure, dying. Stamper had told him this plainly before he resumed work. The lung damage is permanent. You may have years, you may not. You should know that every winter will be harder than the last. Reginald thanked him and went back to Qinghe. The years that followed were, there is no simpler way to put it, extraordinary, not extraordinary in the way that newspapers celebrate, with numbers and monuments and documented miracles that can be reported without ambiguity. Extraordinary in the quieter, more stubborn sense. The sense in which a small flame held consistently is, over time, more transformative than a large explosion that comes and goes. He began to gather people for prayer. Not converts, not students, not a congregation, a small group of people who had sensed in him something they wanted to be near. They met before dawn, as Wentworth's group met in Manitoba, in a low silent room in the back of a merchant's home. They prayed for the villages around them. They prayed for the other missionaries scattered across the province. They prayed for China. All of it. Always all of it. Sometimes they prayed in silence for an hour at a stretch, and the silence was not empty. People began to change in the villages. Reginald visited, not dramatically, not all at once. But a woman who had been bitter for years softened. A man who had been gambling away his family's income stopped. A family that had been in conflict for a generation found, in a manner no one could fully account for, a way to speak to one another again. These were not the kind of changes that make it into reports sent back to Toronto. They were the kind of changes that the people who lived them knew were not ordinary. One morning in the winter of 1907, Reginald did not appear at the dawn prayer meeting. Qinghe, who had become, in the years since finding him in the road, one of his closest friends and the quiet backbone of the prayer group, went to his room and found him lying on the floor. Not unconscious, simply lying on the floor, very still, his face against the cold wood, his lips moving. Qinghe stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain whether to enter. "I'm all right," Reginald said, without looking up. I needed to be lower than the chair." Qinghe understood this, somehow, in the way that people who have spent long hours in prayer together develop an understanding for things that cannot easily be explained to anyone else. He went back to the prayer room and told the others, and they prayed, and Reginald joined them an hour later, moving slowly and breathing with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to work with very little air. That spring, Stamper examined him again. The physician sat for a long time afterward without speaking. He asked Reginald to breathe in and out several times, then several more. He used the stethoscope in a way that seemed, to Reginald, more concentrated than usual. Finally, he set the instrument down and looked at his patient with an expression that was not quite confusion and not quite alarm, but something in the territory between them. "I need to ask you something," Stamper said. "All right, have you changed something? Your diet? Your routine? Anything?" "I sleep less than I used to," Reginald said. "I pray more." Stamper looked at him. "The damage I mapped in your left lung 2 years ago," he said slowly, "has not progressed in the way I would have expected. In fact, and I want to be very careful about this because I am not a man who makes claims I cannot support, there are areas that appear to be better." He paused. "I cannot explain that." Reginald said nothing. "I'm going to write to a colleague in Beijing," Stamper said. "I'd like a second opinion on these readings." The second opinion came back 6 weeks later and confirmed what Stamper had seen. The lung tissue that should have continued deteriorating had instead stabilized in ways that Stamper's colleague described, in careful and slightly evasive medical language, as clinically unusual. Reginald did not tell many people about this. He told Qinghe, and he wrote to Wentworth, and he thanked God quietly and kept working. But his body was not healed, let that be clear. He remained a man with compromised lungs in a country of hard winters, doing physical work in conditions that his physician repeatedly told him were unreasonable for someone in his condition. He coughed. He tired. He had nights when the breathing was so difficult that he lay awake until morning, not sleeping, not exactly praying, simply enduring, with the patient steadiness of a man who has made his peace with the length of the night. He wrote to his mother every month. She was older now, living with his sister in Toronto, and her letters back were warm and full of the small news of the household, who had visited, what the garden was doing, whether Patterson, his old university friend, was still arguing about Virgil. She never asked him to come home. She understood. Somehow, that home was not Hamilton or Toronto. Home was Qinghe. Home was the low-ceilinged room before dawn. In the last years of his life, Reginald became known, though he would have resisted the word and possibly the entire concept, as a man you sought out when you did not know what else to do, not because he had answers. He was famously and sometimes frustratingly reluctant to offer answers, but he had learned to sit with people in the way that few people can, without urgency, without agenda, without the anxious desire to fix or to move on. He had learned this, he once told Qinghe from prayer. When you spend enough time waiting for God, he said, you learn to stop expecting everything to be over quickly. Missionaries came to him from other provinces. Chinese pastors came to him with problems they could not bring to anyone else. A young woman named Constance from Vancouver, newly arrived in China and already devastated by the distance between her expectations and the reality, sat with him for an afternoon in the prayer room and left. She wrote home to her parents, feeling that it was possible to continue. He did not remember what he had said to her. He said something similar to many people. He said it because he believed it, and he believed it because the long years of diminishment and coughing and insufficient sleep had taught him, in the way that only sustained difficulty teaches, that it is always possible to continue. He died in February of 1912. He had been ill for 10 days, a chest infection, the winter's final cruelty. And on the morning of the 11th day he asked Qinghe to open the window, which was unusual. It was cold. But Qinghe opened it, and the light came in across the floor, and Reginald looked at it the way you look at something you are glad to see one more time. He said, "Tell them in Manitoba that it worked." Those were the last coherent words Qinghe heard him speak. The funeral was simple. There were perhaps 40 people in the room. The prayer group, the village school children who had grown up knowing him, a few of the local merchants who had watched with some combination of curiosity and respect the strange Canadian who lived among them for 14 years and never once seemed to be in a hurry. Stamper came from Beijing. He stood at the back of the room with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set in the way that men set their jaws when they are refusing to acknowledge that they are moved. Qinghe spoke. He spoke in Mandarin, and one of the younger missionaries translated quietly for the Canadians in the room, though some of them had been in China long enough not to need it. Qinghe said that Reginald Hollis Carew had taught him what it meant to pray, as though God was listening. He said he understood this was something that should not need to be taught, that it should be obvious to anyone who calls themselves a believer, but that in his experience, it was the rarest thing in the world. He said that some people fill a room when they enter it. Reginald, he said, filled a room when he prayed in it. The room felt different, the air felt different, and whatever scientific explanation might exist for such a sensation, Qinghe had spent 14 years learning to trust it. A letter arrived from Manitoba 2 weeks after the funeral. Cyrus Wentworth, who was by then an old man with grown children and a farm that had been through 3 difficult harvests and was still standing, wrote to Qinghe because he did not know who else to write to. He wrote that on the morning of Reginald's death, the exact morning, the exact hour, so far as either of them could later determine, the prayer group had felt, without any explanation they could account for, a sudden and absolute sense of completion. They had stopped praying. Not because they were finished, not because they had agreed to stop, but because something simply and unmistakably ended. One of the women had wept. She could not say why. Another had said, quietly, that she felt as though a door had closed on one room and opened on another. Wentworth wrote, "We did not know, until your letter came, what it was. Now we know. We are grateful for the privilege of praying alongside a man we never met. Tells his friends that his prayers are not over. We believe they continue. We believe all of it continues, and we will not stop until we see it." Qinghe kept this letter. He kept it in his breast pocket, against his chest, in the way that Reginald had once kept Wentworth's letter, the very first one, the one from the Manitoba farmer who prayed before dawn for strangers on the other side of the world. Qinghe kept it until the paper wore soft with folding and refolding. He showed it to the people who came to him in the years that followed, asking what it meant to pray and not see an answer. He showed it to Constance when she came back to Qinghe on her way to another province. He showed it to the schoolchildren when they were old enough to understand. He did not explain it. He did not need to. Some things speak for themselves, in the language beneath all languages, in the silence that is not empty,